So today we'll be talking about how to cast a spell, which sounds deceptively simple on the surface, but it's actually kind of complicated when you get to the nitty-gritty details of what exactly goes into casting a spell. And there are some interesting corner cases that may come up where it's really important to know the steps in which you cast a spell, because some things that may look illegal actually turn out to be legal, and vice versa. So I guess the first question I want to ask is, why is it important to have a set order for the things that go into casting a spell? And also, let's just hear some things about what actions actually go into casting a spell. So let's hear some ideas.
Consistency.
No, I'm just talking about the actual steps that go into casting a spell.
Putting the card onto the stack.
Putting the card onto the stack, right.
Announcing that card.
Announcing the card.
Using modes.
Using modes.
Using targets.
Choosing targets. Apparently we're just calling out stuff. So, and just like we did with the layers yesterday, eventually we'll put those into the right order on the board. But now let's talk about why it is important that those things happen in some fixed order. Like, couldn't we just decide on a case-by-case basis for each spell in which order it would make most sense to do it for that spell? James?
Certain pieces of information is needed before we can do other things, like knowing what the targets are before we could distribute something.
Correct. And you said something about consistency.
I did.
Yeah, actually, both of you said that. And that is, of course, a very important reason here, that we want the process for casting a spell to be consistent, so that you don't have to learn for each of those 10,000 magic cards in existence how exactly that particular card is supposed to be cast. So we want one unified process for casting a spell that works regardless of which spell you're casting. So let's throw the things that were called out on the board, again in random order. We said something about putting it on the stack. We said something about making choices, I think.
It's about getting backstage.
What else did we say? Did anybody?
Announce was up there. Choose modes. And or
Additional costs.
Announce.
Determining costs.
What else?
Determining costs.
pay cost.
Determine the cost. Or call it total the cost.
Pay the cost.
Pardon?
Pay the cost.
Sure. We have that. Activate mana abilities. I have one more here.
Announcement of additional or alternative costs.
No, you said this one already. I think it's divide or distribute.
Right, divide.
Okay.
Now there's a couple of things that were called out that are not actually specifically on one of those, or that I don't have a specific slip for. One was alternative costs. That falls under choices. Also things like if there's an X in the cost, choosing that also falls under choices. And announce, which I wrote on the board, I consider as part of putting it on the stack. Because putting it on the stack is where the card becomes visible to all players, and that is basically the act of announcing that you're casting that spell. Also, one thing to note is spells aren't the only things that go on the stack. Activated abilities and triggered abilities can also go on the stack. And not surprisingly, there's a lot of similarities between putting a spell on the stack and putting an activated or triggered ability on the stack. You may have targets, you may have choices. Clearly you don't have alternative costs for a triggered ability or cost of any kind for a triggered ability, but all the other things that go into putting an ability on the stack are the same as putting a spell on the stack. So the order is the same. So some examples that we'll talk about later are actually examples of activating an ability, but that works the same as casting a spell. So let's talk about the order in which these things have to happen. When I cast a spell, when does it go on the stack? Does it go on the stack early or late in the process? Ben?
At the very, very beginning.
At the very beginning. Okay. Why?
You have no way of doing anything else if people don't know what it is you're choosing these modes or dividing damage or anything for. You've got to have everything up front.
Good point. Yes, Kevin?
If I have an additional cost that says discard a card, you don't want to discard the card that you're actually casting.
Also a good point.
It needs a place to go somewhere in the game. It's in your hand. Everything in the game has to have a place, and there isn't a place hanging out somewhere before it gets to the stack, but it's not in your hand. So if it's not in your hand, that's something.
Right. So, putting all these things together, your opponent has to know that what you're doing is legal, and the only way that your opponent can verify this is if your opponent can see the spell that you're casting. So, now of course one possibility would be to just reveal it from your hand, and it might still be in your hand at that time, but as Kevin said, there might be an additional cost of discarding the card, and it gets kind of weird if you discard the card that you're casting. So, the very first thing is that the card goes on the stack. There's also other reasons. There could be continuous effects that say spells you cast cost this much more, or spells you cast have rebound. Those effects, of course, only become active and online as soon as the thing hits the stack, because at that point it is a spell that you cast. So in order to give those effects a chance to kick in, we put the card on the stack immediately, and then those effects actually work. All right. In which order should making choices and announcing targets happen? Okay, there.
Choices first,
Choices first, and then targets. Why?
because your choices may affect how many targets you have. So it's kind of like dependencies in a way, in that the number of targets you choose or are able to choose very well could be dependent on the choices on the card.
Correct. And on the Oracle printout on the back of my handout, there is actually at least one example of a spell that would be affected by this. Can anybody find it?
Cryptic command.
Cryptic command, exactly. Or any kind of modal spell where some modes are targeted and other modes are not, would of course be affected by this. Dividing the effect. When should that happen? We're here. Anybody know that? It tells you to divide an effect. Usually we'll divide the effect among whatever targets you specify. So clearly you have to announce those targets first before you can then divide the effect. So obviously it has to come after the targets. Of the remaining three, totaling the cost, paying the cost, activating mana abilities, which one of those should logically come first? Max?
We should calculate the total cost first.
We should definitely calculate the total cost first. Clearly, because, well, we have to know what the cost is before we even attempt to pay it. So, obviously, we want to do that first. And at which point in this sequence does totaling the cost happen? Fireball, exactly. Fireball has a variable number of targets, which of course you have to announce and choose. And that number of targets determines how much you have to pay for the spell. Also, a slightly more arcane example, Kerbeck's Touch, which says something about spells that target it cost more. which of course also is dependent on choosing to target that or something else. So there are definitely examples where how many targets you choose or what targets you choose affect what the spell costs. So it definitely has to come after targets. Now there really isn't a reason why it can't come between targets and dividing. I mean, as far as I know, there is no spell that would change its cost based on how you distribute the effect. But basically, in order to keep all the cost-related activities together, we're calculating the cost after dividing the effect. And what about these two? Activating mana abilities and paying the total cost. Right. Clearly, we have to give the player the ability to make mana first, before we then ask the player to spend that mana. So this is the order in which the 7 parts or steps or whatever you want to call it of casting a spell have to happen. Putting it on the stack, making choices, choosing and announcing targets, dividing the effect, calculating the total cost, activating mana abilities, and finally paying the total cost. And the total cost can be paid in any order, which can sometimes have interesting ramifications. And by the way, there are certain mnemonics for this order here. My favorite is, some crazy teens drink too much pot. That's just the one that I go with. There's another one that says, all crazy teens have tried magic pills, which uses an A for announce rather than S for stack, and an H for howl rather than the D for divide. I like this one better, but whatever floats your boat. So let's talk about examples. Can Fume Spitter target itself? I see lots of nodding. Activating an activated ability works the same way as casting a spell. So you put the ability on the stack. There are no choices to be made for Fume Spitter's ability. There is a target, and Fume Spitter is still on the battlefield at that time. So it is a creature. I can target it. Nothing to divide. The total cost is, well, sacrifice Fume Spitter. I know this. I don't need to activate mana abilities. In fact, I can't activate mana abilities because the total cost does not include a mana payment. And then I pay the cost of sacrificing Fume Spitter. Now the ability is on the stack. What happens when it resolves? Who said countered?
It's countered on resolution.
Right. So basically it was a trick question. The ability doesn't resolve. It is countered on resolution because its target became illegal when I sacrificed it to pay the cost. Can Royal Assassin commit suicide? Joe? Either it's untapped, either it starts out untapped, in which case it wouldn't be a legal target at the time I have to choose a target, or it is tapped, in which case it would be a legal target by the time I announce the target, but I don't have the resource necessary to pay the cost of tapping it. So, exactly as you said, Royal Assassin cannot commit suicide. More interesting. Let's say I have a Pyromancer Ascension on the battlefield. I have Lingering Souls in the graveyard, and I flashback Lingering Souls. Does that trigger Pyromancer Ascension's ability for adding a counter to it? Exactly. Very first step of casting it is to move it out of the graveyard and put it onto the stack. And then after you finish everything else and paying the cost, at that point, the spell counts as cast, and Pyromancer Ascension now checks whether a spell or a card with the same name is in your graveyard, and, well, the Lingering Souls that you just cast is not there, because it's already on the stack. Let's say I have 3 Lotus Petals on the battlefield. My opponent casts a spell that I don't like, so I counter it with Stoic Rebuttal. Since I control 3 artifacts, and let's say those 3 Lotus Petals are the only artifacts I have. So I have 3 artifacts, so Metalcraft, and of course, being the tricky guy I am, when it comes time to activate mana abilities, I sacrifice 2 Lotus Petals to make blue mana. So now suddenly I don't control 3 artifacts anymore. Is that a problem?
No, because you totaled your costs and stuff before.
Correct. I first calculate the total cost, and at that point the cost becomes locked in. So even if something happens that changes the cost after this point, it doesn't matter. The game calculated how much I owe it, and that is the cost that I have to pay. So I can sacrifice 2 Lotus Petals, lose the Metal Craft bonus, but it doesn't matter. The cost is still just 2 blue. I pay it, and I'm done. I control Omnath, Locus of Mana. And let's say I cast, right, Momentous Fall. And I want to tap 4 forests to cast the mana cost, or to pay the mana cost for Momentous Fall. And of course, as an additional cost to cast Momentous Fall, I have to sacrifice a creature, and because I'm mean like that, I am choosing to sacrifice Omnath. How many cards do I draw? So this is one of those cases where it becomes important that you can pay the cost in any order. There's 2 components to the cost, pay mana and sacrifice the creature. If I sacrifice the creature first, it was a 5/5 when it was sacrificed, and then I pay the mana, which changes Omnath to a 1/1, but that doesn't matter because Omnath is dead. If I pay the mana first, Omnath becomes a 1/1, and then I sacrifice it as a 1/1. And then when Momentous Fall resolves, it asks, so what was the power of the sacrificed creature? Depending on when you sacrificed it, it was a 1/1 or a 5/5. So when the game looks at the last known information to find out the power, it either sees a 1 or a 5, depending on which way you went. So you draw 1 or 5 cards. Let's say you have Ashnod's Altar, which allows you to sacrifice a creature for mana. Can I announce a spell that has Convoke and tap a creature for Convoke and also sacrifice it for mana? It's all the same guys again. Yes, back there.
No, because sacrificing the creature with Ashnod's Altar is a mana ability. And
Okay.
tapping it for mana is part, or tapping it to reduce the cost is part of total cost. Yeah, you can. Sorry, I was tricking myself.
Well, what happens in this step? Total cost.
You determine what the cost is.
You determine what the cost is. Right. At what point do we actually tap a creature for Convoke?
Well, it's not producing mana.
Right.
It's
At what point do you do the actual act of tapping the creature, Joe?
Choices?
Good guess, but
That would be paying costs.
yes, it becomes part of paying the cost. Convoke is kind of weird that way, because up in the choices part, you announce your intent of using the Convoke ability and which creatures you are intending to tap for the Convoke cost. And that basically is an additional cost that buys you a cost deduction. It's kind of weird. You're trading one cost for another. I'm saying I'm going to tap this guy for the Convoke cost, but at the point where you're making the choices, you're just announcing that. You're not tapping anything yet. The actual tapping comes at the very end, because you're basically rolling the act of tapping that guy into your total cost, which you pay at the very end. And as you said, you have to activate your mana abilities before you pay the total cost, and that is where you would sacrifice it to Ashnod's Altar to make mana. So then, oops, you can't tap it anymore because you just sacrificed it. So no, that doesn't work. And it doesn't work because activating mana abilities is a separate step that happens first before you pay your total cost. And that is actually something that a lot of people don't realize. They conflate the concept of tapping a land for mana with the act of paying that mana for paying the spell. And it's important in edge cases like this to realize that they're actually separate steps. First, you tap the lands to withdraw mana from them, and then you use the mana you withdrew to pay the total cost. And those are 2 separate and independent actions that are part of casting a spell. Next question?
Yeah, on Convoke, when you make it in the choices and announce that you're going to be convoking, you're not announcing which creatures, you're just announcing how many, right? Or do you have to announce which creatures are going to be invoked?
You have to announce which creatures because the cost reduction is actually dependent on which creatures you tap.
On the
because
color,
you,
right.
because you get a color reduction based on the color of the creature that you're intending to tap. So basically, if I have a green creature, I say I'm going to convoke by tapping this green creature, which buys me a 1 green mana cost reduction on the total cost. So let's talk about this step here, the total cost. There's actually a sub-order here in calculating the total cost that we haven't actually talked about, and maybe it's useful to talk about it, because there are certain things that go into the total cost, and the order in which we calculate those is also kind of important to talk about. Yes, Ben? So we have things that increase the cost. We have things that decrease the cost. Right. What else did you say?
Setting effects, transfer.
Right, Trinisphere. Well, Trinisphere is the only card in existence that does what Trinisphere does. There's no other card that has a similar effect. And of course, we have to start with something before we start to increase. What are we starting with? Anybody? That's not bad. Yes. The mana cost? Yes. Or somebody else?
Converted mana cost? Just
Nope.
whatever.
Is it alternate cost? Alternate cost. Yeah. Why do we increase before we decrease? Trent.
To get the most out of the decrease?
Right, to get the most out of the decrease. Let's say I'm casting an ornithopter reason, and we apply the increasers first, then the decreasers, and then Trinisphere because that's what Trinisphere does. Let's say I control a Sky Shroud Elf, and it is on the oracle sheet in the back. And I control a Ashnod's Altar. Ashnod's Altar allows me to sacrifice a creature to make 2 colorless mana. Sky Shroud Elf allows me to filter colorless mana into red or white mana. And I have a Lightning Helix that I want to cast on my opponent, which conveniently casts 1 red and 1 white mana. So the only permanents I have are Ashnod's Altar and Sky Shroud Elf. And this is sort of kind of a puzzle.
Yeah.
Can I cast Lightning Helix with just those 2 permanents? Okay, so let's walk through it. Well, first, of course, I announce Lightning Helix. I put Lightning Helix on the stack. There are no choices. I target my opponent. There's nothing to divide. I calculate the total cost. Flying away. I calculate the total cost. Well, there's nothing to calculate. It's 1 red, 1 white. Now I get the choice to activate mana abilities. So I'm going to say, well, I guess I'm going to activate Sky Shroud Elf's filtering ability. I'm not quite sure yet where I'm going to get the colorless mana from, but I'll worry about that later. So I activate that ability. And of course, mana abilities are special because they don't go on the stack, but they still follow this procedure of going through the steps for activating an ability. So we basically now go into a subroutine for activating the Sky Shroud Elf ability, which says, well, you need to pay 1 colorless mana to activate this ability. How would you like to pay for that? I'm going to say, well, I'm going to activate Sky Shroud Elf's ability. For which I go into another subroutine call that asks, how are you going to pay for that? Well, I'm going to sacrifice Sky Shroud Elf to Ashnod's Altar. So, okay, this fly is annoying. So now, I have this, it's kind of like Inception, you know, from casting Lightning Helix, we went into activating Sky Shroud Elf's ability, or the filtering ability. From that, we went into Sky Shroud Elf's filtering ability. From that, we went into Ashnod Altar's mana ability, activating that. To pay the cost, I sacrifice Sky Shroud Elf, so it's now in the graveyard. Now, Ashnod Altar's mana ability resolves. I get 2 colorless mana to my mana pool, which I now can use to pay for the second activation of Sky Shroud Elf's filtering ability, which gives me red mana to my mana pool. Then the first activation resolves, giving me the other color. I forget which one I just named. So now I have 1 red and 1 white mana in my mana pool, which I now use to pay for Lightning Helix's total cost. So the long and short of this is that yes, it is legal if you do it exactly that way.
Phyrexian mana, how does that fit into casting a spell?
Would somebody like to take a stab at it? Like basically, at some point, you have to make the decision between paying mana or paying life, which ideally you would make before you activate your mana abilities. So that logically would conclude that we want to do it when we calculate the total cost. Ben?
I think it might be during choices, because that's when we chose hybrid costs.
Correct.
Phyrexian seems very similar to hybrid.
Correct. It actually happens in choices. We could theoretically delay it up to this point, but the way the rules are written, Phyrexian mana is very similar to hybrid mana, and for hybrid mana, you make the choices up here, you know, which mana symbol you're paying with which color. Yeah.
How does Phyrexian mana interact with Trinisphere?
How does Phyrexian mana interact with Trinisphere? Well, when we calculate the total cost, let's say I'm casting the Taxian Probe on my opponent, which costs 1 Phyrexian blue, right? And I choose to pay it with life. So when I go to my total cost, the mana cost is 1 Phyrexian blue, for which I chose to pay it with life. So there is no mana being paid in my cost, because I'm just paying life. So then Trinisphere asks, are you paying 3 mana for this? No. You are paying no mana for this, so please pay 3 mana and 2 life. And that's how that works. Yeah, even though there is a mana symbol for which you're paying something to pay that mana symbol cost, you're not actually paying mana when you're paying life. So Trinisphere asks you to pay 3 mana. So 2 life and 3 mana. Yes, anything else? Any other questions? Well, I guess we're done. Thank you for your attention.